So this morning we conclude our sermon series on being bold. And it has been a powerful series to work on and been grateful for the response so far. Every week I've wanted to kind of catch everybody up because not everybody has been here every week. For some of you, this might be the first week you've been this year. And so I want to just kind of catch you up with what we've been doing. We began the first Sunday of the year as we celebrated Holy Communion, and we talked about bold sacrifice. We talked about the sacrifice that God made on our behalf. The second week, we talked about bold vision, and I continued really, what we've been doing for the past few years together, is talking about the vision that I believe God has for Atlanta First United Methodist Church, of being in service and ministry in the city of Atlanta, of reaching out to that next generation of Atlantans that will call this place home, and from this place, they'll go out into the community, into the world to make a difference. The third week was we were honoring the legacy of Dr. King on Martin Luther King weekend, and we talked about bold service. So we talked about, as a part of that vision, what it looks like to serve with boldness. What are some of the things we think this church could do in the not-so-distant future to really reach out and to make a difference? Last week we talked about bold stewardship, and we talked about what it means to give back, to give sacrificially, to not live in a theology of scarcity, but to live in a theology of abundance, to be able to understand and think about those things that we have rather than focusing and worrying about those things that we don't have. As I thought about wrapping up this series this morning, a couple of things occurred to me. As we jumped into the series, I can't remember if I ever defined bold. I think I may have, but I thought maybe we'd come as we wrap this up and think about what it means to be bold. I've tried to illustrate that, and so maybe our definition has come through illustration. But I love the definitions on the Merriam-Webster app on my iPhone here. Fearless before danger, showing or requiring a fearless, daring spirit. Showing or requiring a fearless, daring spirit. So as you think about sacrifice, if you're fearless in your sacrifice, you're not worried about what's going to happen to you. If you're fearless in your vision, you're more concerned about others than you are yourself. If you're fearless in your service, then you don't think about the consequences of the cost. If you're fearless in your stewardship, again, you don't worry about what you don't have, but you focus on what you do and how you can make a difference with that. And I think it all comes together in this word faith. That really is, if we had a single thread that tied together this concept of boldness, that really what it is all about is faith. Now, I've probably told this at least a couple times since I've been here, and y'all have all heard this story, but I can't talk about faith without telling my favorite preacher joke, which is the two gentlemen that are sitting outside their front porch, and they're told that the floodwaters are coming, and the bus comes by to pick up the evacuees, and they said, "No, we have faith that God is going to save us." The bus says, "Well, you stay at your own risk." And later that day, the floodwaters have risen, and they're now on the second floor balcony of this house, and the boat comes by, a rescue boat comes by and says, the floodwaters are only going to continue to rise. You've got to come with us, and we have faith that God is going to save us. Several hours later, they're standing on the roof of their house, and one final rescue attempt is made by a helicopter that drops one of those ladders that's dangling in the air, and the two men again say, "We have faith that God is going to save us." The floodwaters consume them and overcome them, and they die, and they go to heaven, and they ask St. Peter, "We want to talk to God. We had faith that God was going to save us." And they get in to see God, and God said, "I sent you a bus, a boat, and a helicopter. What else did you want?" When we talk about faith, it's not a blind faith. Sometimes what we need is right in front of us, and we can't see it. Sometimes the very thing that can make a difference in this world is right at our disposal, and we fail to utilize it. Probably the most well-known Christian text on faith comes from the letter to the Hebrews, the 11th chapter, beginning in the first verse. Hebrews 11, verse 1. Some of you will be familiar with this, and even if you've not studied the Bible, this is something that is well known in secular culture as well. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Faith. I've known some incredible people with incredible faith throughout my life. I've known people who lived their lives purely by faith. That number of people that really, really, truly just live by faith, I probably could count on one hand, because most of us, including your preacher for the morning, tends to kind of keep one foot in faith and one foot on my own abilities. I kind of hold on to what I can do rather than letting go and allowing God to do all that God can do. We tend to be controlling, particularly in Western culture and civilization. We tend to think that we can do everything. My favorite scripture from Ephesians ends with, "Now to him who by the power of God is able to accomplish far more abundantly all than we can ask or imagine." What Paul is saying to the church in Ephesus is that you are limited by your human mind. But with God, what you can do is limitless. Now, one of the challenges we have in our world today is that we put faith in all kind of things and stuff and people. And I mentioned the football game that will be taking place this afternoon. It'll be one of the most watched, if not the most watched event of the entire year. As I said, I really could not care less now that the Falcons are not in it. I'm less excited about this Super Bowl for a variety of reasons than I am any other one. The only thing I've kind of been able to cling to a little bit is that Michael Oher, who is the character for whom the movie The Blind Side was made, is a Baltimore Raven. And as much as I don't want the Ravens to win for some other reasons, some of you might be aware of, suddenly I was conflicted this week when I thought about a true Hollywood ending for a young man to go from homelessness to a Super Bowl champion. By the way, because of the faith of a family who are willing to take this young man in and give him a home and give him a hope and give him a future. So maybe I can overcome some of my issues, and maybe Michael Oher could be the MVP, and we could celebrate him in that story. But then again, on the other side of the ball, Mr. Kaepernick, that kind of did us in a couple weeks ago. A story of a young man who was adopted and whose family has raised him as their own, and who has overcome incredible odds to, in his first year as a starter in the NFL, to reach the Super Bowl. There's a reason that sports are compelling beyond all the money and all the fame. Sports play out in front of our eyes in ways that are unscripted and unexpected. But yet it seems with each week that comes, our heroes, one at a time, we realize how very flawed they can be. And so we look to sport to encourage us. But I'm not sure that's where we should place our faith and our trust. We place our faith in economic systems. And the problem with that is that human beings run those economic systems. And human beings, as I've already said, are deeply flawed. And so are economic systems on which are built from these people who have the best of intentions, but sometimes let the human condition get in the way. So how do we move to a bold faith? What does a bold faith look like? Well, we've begun to define that as we talk about the faith that allows us to do those things we've already talked about this month. But faith is, we tend to think of faith as being something that is static. But what I want to talk about this morning is that faith is not about sitting and waiting. Faith is about getting up and going to do. I'll say it again. Faith is not about sitting around and waiting. But faith is about getting up and going to do something. Earlier in this series, we talked about vision. And we talked about the vision that President Kennedy set forth for the country to put a man on the moon and return him safely home again. This past week on PBS, they ran a series that's the history of the space program in the United States, beginning from the earliest missions with Alan Shepard all the way through the retirement of the space shuttle program. Just in the past couple of weeks, we've had the anniversaries of both the disasters of Challenger and Columbia, as we remember those who gave their lives in the quest for something beyond our imagination. No matter how many times I see the footage of Neil Armstrong taking that last step off of that spacecraft and his foot landing on the moon, I get chills. I get teary-eyed. Because that whole process, from the time that President Kennedy made that declaration to the time that it took place, required tremendous faith. But it was a very active faith. It was thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and women working together to do something that had never been done before, to see something that had never been seen. What was amazing was when they talk about the thing that they didn't expect. Twofold. One is no one had ever seen the backside of the moon until the Apollo mission. And so there was several missions that progressed toward the actual moon landing. But the second was to see the earth rise. We had seen the sun rise and we had seen the moon rise. But no one had yet seen the earth rise. Until men were able to escape the gravitational pull of the earth and see the earth as a globe. And then to come from the backside of the moon and see the earth rise. It was a journey. Faith is, as I said, is active. And so what it is that we're moving down a path. And eventually what happens is that which has been invisible becomes visible. I think the best illustration I've had of this in my life is in hiking, particularly if we're hiking in the mountains. And often if you're hiking in the mountains, you're traversing the mountain in kind of a zigzag manner, and you see the peak at times, but because of the nature of the way you have to traverse the mountain, you'll see it and then it gets behind the trees, and then you see it again and it's behind some boulders. And it's not until you arrive at the very peak that you're able to see what was once invisible as visible. And then as you stand and look down, you see something. You saw that trail, you saw that valley 1 foot at a time, but you never could imagine what it looked like as you stood at the top and looked down. It was a completely different perspective. That which had been invisible becomes visible. Faith is critical to who we are. Our faith is critical, I believe, to the human existence. Ultimately, our faith is in God, but we also have to have faith in each other. We have to believe in the best of who God created. If we go back to our text this morning, the third verse, Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was made out of what was not visible. God created the earth out of a formless void." Most of what is created in this world is the very same thing. All of the technology that we use in our lives was once just bits and pieces that existed in other places, but never in one cohesive form. Whether that be computers or aircraft or any number of pieces of technology that create creature comforts for us in this world. People had to imagine them and create them. There's a movie coming out about Steve Jobs, and there's some questions about whether or not Ashton Kutcher does a good job portraying Steve Jobs, but it reminds us once again of his brilliance, and that the gentleman that, Wozniak, the guy that was kind of his partner in all of that, had no vision, no imagination for the fact that people would ever want to have a computer sitting on their desk. So Jobs' brilliance was as much about seeing that which was not yet visible. He said, people can't know they want something that they're not aware exists. And so bold faith tells us that we've got to move out in bold ways toward things that we can't yet see, but we can imagine by faith, that we believe because of God's promises. And so everything that we've talked about over the past 4 weeks requires bold faith. To imagine the possibility of what Atlanta First can yet be again requires tremendous faith, not blind faith. I've said before, I wouldn't be here if I was just wishing, blowing out some candles and kind of blindly throwing some darts at the wall. But what God shows me around us is incredible potential. And bold faith says that we continue to step forward one step at a time into that reality. We go from what we can't see to what we can. And every time we get to that new place of ability to see, there's something yet again on the horizon. You think about exploration in this world. You think about all the men and women who have gone from one place to a place that they've never been, that they didn't think anybody had ever been. There's a great contemporary Christian song that talks about the explorers coming to this country, and that when they get here, they're tired, they're cold, they're hungry. And the first thing they want to do is get back on the boat and go back to what they knew, to what was comfortable. And the song says, we're going to burn the ships. We're not going back to where we were because we've come too far by faith. And so part of what we have to do is resist the temptation to go back to what is comfortable. The human condition is to retreat to that place of comfort, even if it's not what is in our best interest. Faith propels us forward into the unexpected future that God has in store for us. So in this journey of sermon writing, you never know when, in preparing a sermon, that the story is going to come to you. Yesterday morning, we were out on a run, and one of my friends said, "Hey, did you hear about that story in the paper?" And this was the story I knew that we needed to hear this morning. It seems there's a young woman in Athens, Georgia, who's a cross-country star, Clark Central High School. And she was out for a training run back in early January. And during that training run, she and her friend crossed the street, and someone failed to yield and hit her. And she now is suffering from a traumatic brain injury and in intensive care at the hospital in Athens. Well, an amazing thing happened. As word spread that this young woman had been injured, then the community began to circle around this family. The community began to reach out to her parents, to the students at the school. Incredible things began to happen. The dad says that we're seeing people from across the country praying for her, and this is an article from the Athens, from the Athens Banner Herald. We were seeing people from across the country praying for her, he said. A gentleman, a family friend who's known Grace since she was a baby and who lives in Japan, spent last weekend making 1,000 origami cranes that we have hanging in the waiting room. It's been a wild journey, and the outpouring of love has been huge. Well, immediately I had to look up what 1,000 origami cranes meant. There's a book that was published in the 1970s that tells the story of a young woman from Japan who, because of the radiation following the bombing, developed leukemia as a young woman. And there's an ancient myth that says that the crane has the power to grant a wish or to bring healing or wellness or wholeness to someone who is able to make 1,000 cranes. The myth says that the crane lives to be 1,000 years old, and that's why the number of cranes is significant. The young woman got to 660 some odd cranes before she succumbed to the disease of leukemia. This symbol has now become a global phenomenon in which these 1,000 cranes made through the ancient art and tradition of origami are strung together, and they're done so and sent to people who need that hope. It's been adopted by other faiths and other traditions. So this person in Japan handmade 1,000 of these cranes and shipped them to be a symbol of hope for this family. He says the main point is how this 17-year-old girl, this is her father continuing, has impacted a lot of people. And so the community all wants to respond when something terrible happens like this, or this is her mother, excuse me. Everyone is trying to find a way to help. All denominations, all belief systems, everybody is tapping into their faith, which is something we tend to tuck in our back pocket. Sometimes the best theology we ever hear or read comes from people in their midst of these moments. That people are acting in faith. And because of that, a difference is being made in the lives of others. But she says we tend to tuck it in our back pocket. There's nothing bold about tucking our faith in our back pocket. We have to be willing to share both our faith in God and illustrate that faith in actions, in ways that make a difference. Now, this is one of those rest of the story stories. It seems that this young woman had developed quite a relationship or had made quite an impact on one of the coaches, Drew Harrow, who was both an assistant cross-country coach at Clark Central as well as active in the Catholic community at the University of Georgia. And so following this event on January 11th, and this was the article that was in the AJC this week. Following these events of the 11th, Drew had made his way to the hospital room several occasions to visit Grace. And he was scheduled to run the Baton Rouge Marathon in Louisiana Marathon down in Baton Rouge. He went to Grace's room. She's still not responding, but he told her that he was going to run the race in her honor. When he arrived, for those of you that aren't aware, when you run marathons typically now, and in many races, that if you've pre-registered, you get your bib with your number on it, and it also has your name written across the bottom. Well, when Drew got to pick up his number, there was no name written on his bib. And his sister says, I think you ought to write Grace's name on the bib. So she's an art teacher, his sister's an art teacher, and she wrote Grace very legibly, very perfectly. And he pinned it on. He gets to the halfway point, and he realizes that he's running a PR, that is personal best. Before long, he's leading the marathon. And the bystanders begin to cheer him on, and they're calling him Grace, even though they're looking and thinking, this doesn't match up. He won the marathon. So he calls and talks to Grace's dad. And she said, he asked Drew, he said, what time did you finish the marathon? And Drew said about 10:30 that morning. He said, well, Drew, what you don't know is as you traveled to Louisiana to run the marathon, we got word that things were turning for the worst. We were calling in the family. The priest from the Catholic ministry at the University of Georgia was called to give her the rights of the sick and the dying. That was on Friday evening. About Sunday morning at 10:30, She began to make progress. She began to improve. Now look, she's still in a lot of danger. She is still in a coma, a medically induced coma, and she still has a long way to go, and they don't know the extent of her brain damage. And just like I said last week about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, I don't know how that miracle transpired, and many people will want to write this off as a coincidence. Many people will want to write this off as parents just wishing and hoping that their daughter would get better. And I can't explain it, but here's what I know. Is that doctors can't explain it either. That a young woman who was near death on Friday at least was making some progress Sunday morning is a man who, in an act of faith, not knowing what he was doing, all he did was say, you know what? I'm going to go run this race, and I'm going to give it the very best that I have. And I'm going to do it not for me, but for somebody else. And the prayers and the well wishes of those along that route that had no idea who Grace Byrne was, somehow, in the process of all of that, she's improving. Bold faith has us take bold actions that result in bold outcomes. Each of us needs to find ways to faithfully follow God's call. Certainly not all of us can run marathons in 2.5 hours. Most of us can't run 5 miles in 2.5 hours, much less 26.2. But each of us, as I've said in the process of this series, can do something to make a difference. Jesus talked about the faith of a mustard seed. In Hebrews, we hear that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.